Now, 1925, T.S. Eliot published a new collection of his work. In that collection was one of his most famous and often quoted poems, The Hollow Men. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the poem, it is about a group of these scarecrow-like creatures forever stuck on the bank of the river Styx between the worlds of the living and the dead, describing the horrors that they see. Charming stuff. At the end of the poem, our narrator tells us, this is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. Now, to pinpoint exactly what Eliot was talking about when he wrote this line is a little tough. He was going through a particularly rough time in his life when he wrote it, but for some, myself included, we like to see it as a commentary on the needlessness and the destruction of war. Remember, this was written in 1925 in the aftermath of the First World War, something of which Eliot was a very vocal critic. Essentially what he's saying is that we all strive, humankind strives to end in this blaze of glory, big bang, where there's one clear victor to be remembered throughout history, where the reality is that we'll all likely perish in a much more somber way, without much of that big bang to withstand the test of time. Again, super charming stuff for a Friday morning. But today, I want to talk about that last line, not with a bang, but a whimper. The reality is, and I hate to break it to you, this world is coming to an end. Again, this is super uplifting talk for a Friday morning. I'm sure that this is exactly what you wanted to hear, but the truth is our world is coming to an end. Now, don't get me wrong. Most people, pretty much everybody in this room, will have absolutely no idea that the world has ended. Food will taste the same, everything will look the same, we'll go about our lives in the exact same way. But make no mistake, everything is subject to be completely different. As you could probably guess, at this point, I'm talking in very dramatic fashion about the blockchain. Now, if you are unfamiliar with the blockchain, do not fret, you are not alone. Ahead of this event, my company and I decided to conduct a little bit of research to figure out just how much people across the country knew about blockchain technology and some of its uses, such as cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin. We found that just about half of Americans were familiar with what Bitcoin is, and when we dug a little deeper, we found that over 90% of Americans, and that number was increasing as we collected data, over 90% of Americans had absolutely zero idea or were just vaguely familiar with how the blockchain operated. Now, by show of hands, and don't be shy, how many people here would find themselves in that 90%? Okay, most of you, excellent. I can lie my way through the rest of this, it's wonderful. No, I figure I'll tell the truth, it's fine. Well, we found that this 90%, and that number would have continued rising. So instead of talking about the complexity of how the blockchain operates, and it is complex. I mean, I myself am confused by it sometimes, and I'm up here talking to you, so don't worry. Instead of talking about that confusing elements that make up this technological infrastructure, why don't we talk about some real-world applications that show how the blockchain can really change our lives for the better? Now, picking a subject for today, I'll admit, was a little tough. We could really be talking about anything from medical records to energy grids, for example. Just last week, Walmart, of all companies, was awarded 3 new patents for storing their medical records on the blockchain, Walmart. So we really could talk about virtually anything. But I figured we would talk about something that everybody here, or hopefully everybody here, can relate to. So again, by show of hands, how many people here currently keep their money in a bank or financial institution of some kind? Okay, I see there's a handful of you who didn't raise your hand, and I'd be curious to know what Illuminati-like secrets you know about keeping your money safe that I don't. But for the most part, we all keep our money in these institutions. And if you're anything like me, then when you walk up to an ATM, when I walk up to an ATM, I like to picture that behind this machine there's a little box that says, Corey Padveen's cash. Great, give me some credit. I do know that this is not how it works. But when we keep our money in a bank, we like to think that it is safe and secure and ours. And for the most part, that is true. Banks do have a responsibility to give us our money back and to use it properly. Whether or not they do, that's another story. But they do have that responsibility. But imagine for 1 second if tomorrow your bank, your financial institution, stopped doing business and shut its doors. Not all that fun to think about. Well, did you know that after the market crash in 1929, 9,000 American banks failed? And I know what you're thinking. Corey, that was almost 90 years ago. What are you talking about? Why are you up here? Well, did you know that after the crash in 2008, 500 American banks failed? That's the world we're living in today, and it's not just some distant memory with no chance of repeating itself. Granted, we have federal insurance programs, we have deposit insurance programs, Federal Reserve programs that are all in place to prevent these kinds of issues from spiraling out of control. But what if I were to tell you that there was a way to use technology to make these fail-safes not really necessary anymore, at least not in the capacity that they're in right now? That's essentially the power of the blockchain. We can socialize data, privacy, and risk. Now let's take a look at a little bit of a deeper example, and I promise this is the last time I'll ask you to raise your hand. But once again, by show of hands, how many people here have ever used a form of tap payment, whether it's with your phone or a wearable device, for Google Pay, Apple Pay, or the Starbucks app, something like that? Okay, so a pretty sizable chunk of people. And that's not too surprising when you consider that about 140 million people worldwide currently use that technology. And it's pretty fascinating. I mean, this is the kind of thing that just a few years ago would have been considered science fiction. Now, when we're standing in line, already staring at our phones, we now no longer need to break contact with our phone to look at another person, which is the height of millennial anxiety, and we could just lower our phone down, pay for whatever it is we're buying, whatever coffee we're getting, and go about our day. Plain and simple. We think about it as a minor technological convenience, then when it doesn't work, we completely lose our minds and break down. But did you know that in that little tap, in that 1 second, there can be upwards of 5 intermediaries taking part in that process? That means that there are 5 steps in the process. That means that there can be upwards of 5 fees being collected. And that means, for the purpose of our discussion today, most importantly, we can see upwards of 5 different entry points for an attack by a hacker or a hacking group looking to steal our data and information. And we don't really give much credence to that little tap, more so than we do to the coffee that we're ordering by paying for it with that. Now, when any one of these intermediaries falters, they work very hard to secure our data, but when any one of them falters, it doesn't matter how secure your data was in the last step or how secure it would have been in the next step. Your information is compromised. Again, little convenience that we like to think about, but in its current form, it's kind of the exact opposite. It's kind of like if the Death Star had 5 major design flaws, which would have led to its complete destruction, and that would have made for a much shorter Star Wars series. Getting back on track, there must be a better way. Now, don't get me wrong. These data security firms and tech companies work extremely hard to protect our information. I remember I was on a flight to Dallas a couple of years ago. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. I was wearing a suit. I was headed to some meetings. I want to get this right. It was, I think, 100,000 degrees of humidity in Dallas. And I'm giving you more information than you need because I want you to know exactly what my mindset was when a gentleman sits down beside me and decides this is the perfect opportunity to start a conversation. Not exactly my cup of tea before I've had a cup of coffee, but being the polite Canadian that I am, I indulge him. Glad I did, because it turns out he works for one of the world's largest data security firms. He tells me about the process they go through to protect our information. He tells me about the hundreds of engineers that he has working in real time to fight off against hackers and these armies of hackers who are trying to steal data to sell on the dark web. Estimates put that the market for stolen data at about $100 billion in the last 7 years. Those same estimates suggest that hackers can make upwards of $40 an hour stealing and selling data, which, completely objectively, pretty decent hourly wage. Not that I'm advocating anybody go out here and start stealing data. I'm just saying credit where credit's due. It's a pretty good job if you can get it. But the point here is that this is essentially our last line of defense. When they falter, we see stories like the Sony, Target, Equifax, or Walmart hacks, just to name a few, that have left the data of hundreds of millions of people available on the dark web for sale. Enter the blockchain. Now, not to get too deep into the technological infrastructure of how it works, but essentially what the blockchain does is it offers up an ecosystem wherein all members of that ecosystem who are part of a specific set of transactions or a ledger are equally responsible for verifying the coding through the technological structure and ensuring that no malice is taking place when a transaction is conducted. It's kind of like a wedding where you have all of your friends and family in attendance to witness a union between 2 people. But instead of 2 people, it is an exchange of data. And instead of all of your friends and family in attendance, it is a bunch of nameless, faceless servers that operate on a basis of a structure. Not quite as romantic, but equally as official and somewhat more official depending on who you ask. So, with that, let's take a look at how this tap payment would operate. Let's use the example I mentioned before, Starbucks, coffee. You're standing in line, you're about to pay. Now, instead of 5 intermediaries taking place, you would enter an agreement through the system that's been put in place on this blockchain, whereby everybody who's a part of that ledger, that set of transactions, would be equally responsible for overseeing and verifying the transaction, whereby a specific token or a cryptocurrency, which in the case of Starbucks could be called Starbucks, fun. I'll let them have that one. That token can be exchanged all in a single step where it's verified and secured by the very existence of the blockchain. Now again, I'm talking about a hugely simplified example here, but that doesn't make it any less exciting. Essentially, now when you're standing in line, you no longer have to have a severe panic attack when you're about to tap your phone, which in fairness, you might not have been having before, but now, thanks to me, you are. You're welcome. Now let's circle back to Elliot's last line. Not with a bang, but a whimper. Unlike the Facebooks of the world or the internet browsers, this revolution will not be televised. You will not be able to see or touch the blockchain, and in its most exciting form, you'll never even know it was there. So if the world is going to end on a whimper and not with a bang, why are we here talking about it? Well, that has to do with our intrinsic desire to completely ignore, and in some cases even fight against, things that we don't understand, that don't have a tangible effect on our lives. We as a society are particularly averse to change, and that goes especially true on a legislative front. So that means that we may be actively fighting against the implementation of these kinds of technologies. We have at our fingertips the capability to enact a revolution and a reclamation of ourselves through, yes, an admittedly complex technology. But that complexity shouldn't stand in the way of change. I'll close on a note that I think is pretty apropos, considering the venue that we're in today. About a year ago, I was right here at UNLV sitting on a panel talking about innovation. One of my fellow panelists, a brilliant woman who once was mayor of the city, Jan Jones-Blackhurst, made a very funny but a very true observation. She said that it makes absolutely no sense for anyone to be here in Las Vegas. And when you think about it, she's kind of right. The city is in the middle of a very hot desert. It is a strip of land, and all logic, besides the gaming thing, all logic points to this not being a hugely successful city, and yet it has thrived for decades. Why? Well, she noted, it's the city's willingness to embrace change and innovation. There are few cities in the world that embrace these two qualities quite like this one. So I say we take that mantra to heart, because just because the blockchain may seem like a whimper, it is a bang, and it should be treated as such. Thank you all very much.